Sourdough. Defined less by its ingredients and more by its fermentation method, sourdough relies on a natural culture of wild yeast and lactic acid bacteria. During long fermentation, these microorganisms consume sugars in the dough and produce both carbon dioxide and organic acids. The gas creates the bread's open structure, while the acids strengthen gluten and contribute the characteristic tangy flavor. Because sourdough ferments more slowly than commercial yeast breads, it often develops a thicker crust and a more irregular crumb. The final texture balances chewiness with a slightly airy interior. Baguette. This classic French bread is made from a lean dough containing only flour, water, salt, and yeast. Without fat or sugar to soften the crumb, the structure depends entirely on gluten development and proper fermentation. The long, narrow shape increases the surface area exposed to heat in the oven, allowing the crust to become thin and deeply crisp, while the interior remains soft. Steam during baking helps the outer layer expand before hardening, which produces the signature blistered crust. Inside, the crumb shows irregular air pockets created during fermentation and shaping. Ciabatta. Known for its wide, flat shape and open crumb, ciabatta is built from a very high hydration dough. The large amount of water weakens the dough's ability to hold a tight structure, which allows large air pockets to develop during fermentation. Instead of being shaped firmly, the dough is handled gently, so those gas pockets remain intact. When baked, the interior forms an airy, irregular crumb, while the exterior develops a thin crust. This combination of crisp outside and soft, hole-filled interior makes it ideal for sandwiches or dipping in olive oil. Focaccia. A flat Italian bread enriched with olive oil, focaccia sits somewhere between bread and pastry in texture. The dough contains enough gluten to trap fermentation gases, but the generous oil content softens the crumb and prevents it from becoming overly chewy. Before baking, the dough is pressed into a pan and dimpled across the surface. Those dimples hold olive oil and toppings while also preventing the dough from overexpanding in the oven. The result is a bread with a crisp, lightly fried surface and a soft interior. Brioche. Unlike lean breads, brioche is an enriched dough made with large amounts of butter and eggs. These ingredients coat gluten strands and slow down their development, producing a softer, more delicate structure. The fat also traps moisture within the crumb, giving brioche its characteristic tender texture. During baking, the sugar and proteins in the dough promote strong browning through the Maillard reaction. The finished loaf has a light but rich crumb that sits somewhere between bread and cake. Milk bread is popular in East Asian baking. Milk bread relies on a technique called Tangzhong, where a portion of flour is cooked with water or milk before being added to the dough. Heating the starches causes them to gelatinize, allowing them to hold more moisture during baking. This extra hydration produces an extremely soft crumb that remains tender for longer than typical breads. The dough also usually contains milk, butter, and sugar, which further enrich the texture. The final loaf is known for its fluffy, almost cloud-like structure. Bagels. Unlike most breads, bagels are boiled briefly before baking. That boiling step gelatinizes the outer starch layer, forming a tight skin around the dough. When the bagel later goes into the oven, that skin prevents the interior from expanding too quickly. As a result, the crumb remains dense and chewy rather than airy. The baking stage then develops a glossy crust that can support toppings like sesame seeds or poppy seeds. Pretzels. Pretzel dough is typically shaped into knots and treated with an alkaline solution before baking. Traditionally, this solution is food-grade lye, though baking soda is sometimes used as a milder alternative. The alkaline surface dramatically accelerates browning in the oven, producing the deep brown color and distinctive flavor. At the same time, the interior remains soft and slightly chewy because of the gluten structure of the wheat flour. Large salt crystals are often added to balance the rich crust. English muffins are small, round breads cooked on a griddle rather than baked in an oven. The dough is relatively soft, and it is fermented long enough to develop internal gas pockets. When cooked slowly on a hot surface, the exterior forms a thin crust, while the inside finishes steaming. Splitting the muffin with a fork exposes the irregular interior crumb, often called nooks and crannies. Those pockets help trap butter when the bread is toasted. White sandwich bread. Made primarily from refined wheat flour with the bran and germ removed, this bread relies on a very uniform gluten structure that forms when the dough is mixed and kneaded. Because the flour is highly processed, the resulting dough develops a smooth, elastic network that traps carbon dioxide efficiently during fermentation. That trapped gas expands in the oven, producing the soft, even crumb that defines sandwich bread. Many versions also include small amounts of sugar, fat, or milk to keep the texture tender and slow down stalling. The result is a light, neutral bread designed mainly as a carrier for fillings. Whole wheat bread is made from flour that contains the entire wheat kernel, including the bran and germ. Those components introduce more fiber and natural oils into the dough, and that changes how gluten develops during mixing. The bran particles interrupt the gluten network slightly, producing a denser crumb and a more structured bite. Because whole wheat absorbs more water, the dough usually needs longer hydration and fermentation to soften the grain. The finished loaf tends to have a darker crumb and a nuttier flavor. Multi-grain bread combines wheat flour with other grains and seeds such as oats, barley, flax, or sunflower. Because many of these additions do not form gluten, the wheat flour remains the structural base that traps gas during fermentation. The grains absorb water and soften during proofing and baking, producing a slightly denser crumb than standard wheat bread. The finished loaf tends to have a heavier texture and a more layered grain flavor. Rye bread is made from rye flour rather than wheat, and it behaves very differently during baking because rye contains far less gluten-forming protein. Instead of relying on strong gluten networks, rye dough is held together by starches and natural gums that gel during baking. That structure produces a denser crumb and a slightly moist interior. Rye also carries distinctive earthy flavors that develop especially well through slow fermentation. Many traditional rye breads include sourdough starters, which help stabilize the dough and enhance flavor. Parker House rolls. These dinner rolls are made from a soft, enriched dough that includes butter, milk, and sometimes eggs. Before baking, the dough is flattened, brushed with butter, and folded in half, creating the signature layered shape. As the rolls bake, the butter melts between the layers and keeps the crumb tender. The structure remains light and slightly airy, while the surface browns into a soft crust. The result is a roll designed to be pulled apart easily at the table. Challah. Traditionally braided and enriched with eggs, challah develops a soft crumb with a slightly elastic texture. The eggs add fat and proteins that help create a tender interior while still allowing the dough to rise well. Braiding the dough doesn't just create the decorative appearance, it also influences how the bread expands during baking. As the strands rise and separate, they form a pull-apart structure inside the loaf. The surface is typically brushed with egg wash, which produces the glossy crust. Naan. Traditionally baked inside a tandoor oven, naan is made from a soft dough that often includes yogurt or milk. The intense heat of the tandoor causes the bread to inflate rapidly as moisture inside turns to steam, and that expansion creates air pockets while the surface chars slightly against the oven wall. The interior remains soft and flexible, allowing the bread to be used for scooping sauces or wrapping fillings. Pita. Pita bread is known for the hollow pocket that forms during baking. When the dough enters a very hot oven, moisture inside the dough rapidly converts to steam. That steam pushes the upper and lower layers of dough apart, creating the pocket structure. Once removed from the oven, the bread collapses slightly, but retains the separated interior layers. This structure allows pita to be sliced open and filled like a sandwich. Flour tortillas are made from wheat flour, fat, water, and salt. They rely on gluten to give them flexibility. The fat coats the gluten strands slightly, which prevents the dough from becoming overly elastic. After the dough is rolled thin, tortillas are cooked quickly on a hot griddle. The heat causes small steam bubbles to form inside the dough, creating the characteristic blistered surface. Because the bread stays thin and flexible, it can easily wrap around fillings. Cornbread. Built from cornmeal rather than wheat flour, cornbread contains little to no gluten. Instead of yeast fermentation, most versions rely on baking powder or baking soda for leavening. The chemical reaction releases carbon dioxide during baking, producing a crumb that is more crumbly than elastic. The cornmeal itself contributes a slightly coarse texture and a naturally sweet, earthy flavor. Many traditional versions are baked in cast iron, which creates a crisp outer crust. From gluten structure to fermentation and starch chemistry, bread is defined by flour, hydration, and how heat transforms dough into structure. Let us know in the comments what we should explain next. Thanks for watching.